Hey guys, how are you doing? I am back again to talk with you about the structure of the verb group. So we have been talking quite a bit about the structure of the verb phrase and the different types of verb phrases. So the first material that we covered within talking about verb phrases was determining what was happening within the predicate in terms of dividing the verb group apart from all of the other phrases within the predicate, within the VP. So for example, if you had a verb group and you had a direct object, you would have a monotransitive verb phrase. If you have a verb group and a direct object and an indirect object, then you're going to have a ditransitive verb phrase. If you have a verb group and a direct object and an object predicative, then you're going to have a complex transitive verb phrase. So all of that material, I'm going to assume that you are completely comfortable with. If you do have any questions or doubts remaining on that material, please let me know. I'm also going to assume that you are comfortable with the material on the structure of verb phrases. So given that you know that something is a direct object, for example, you're going to know that that needs to be a noun phrase within the verb phrase, and that the two pieces of that verb phrase are first the verb group containing the verb plus all of the auxiliary verbs. Second, the direct object noun phrase. So that's what the structure is going to look like. I have hopefully been successful in switching this visual image around. Please, please let it work, okay? I don't know why it was so difficult to do, but in any case. Okay, so before viewing this, you're going to read chapter 6 in the book. That will talk about all of the material that we're going to go over here. So basically what we're doing is we're thinking about what is happening inside the verb group of English. In other words, not the verb phrase. The verb phrase includes the verb group plus all of the complements of the verb, the direct object, the indirect object, the object predicative, the subject predicative. And the verb group, remember we just made a little triangle and we said, okay, we're not going to worry about what's happening with the internal structure of the verb group. We're just looking at the verb phrase itself. So now we're returning to the verb group itself and we're saying, what's happening inside of the verb group? What's happening inside of that position where you have the main verb and all of the auxiliary verbs? And so what we're going to see is that there are generalizations about where it is that we find a different type of auxiliary verb. So the verb group, as you know, includes all verbs of the sentence. So for each sentence, how many verbs you're going to have? Always at least one. And if you have just one, that will always be the main verb of the sentence. If you have more than one verb, then what's going on? You know that you're going to have one main verb, and then however many verbs are occurring before it, those will all be auxiliary verbs. So since the main verb always occurs last, the most important thing in working on verb groups is to clearly determine what are the units of the verb group. And as soon as you have that settled, it's a matter of categorizing and telling what is the function of that particular item within the verb group. So, for example, if you have the sentence, John had been dreaming about the party, or John had been dreaming about the play. So what's going on here with our verb group? Had been dreaming is our verb group. How do we know that that is our verb group? Why not say that, John is included within that? Well, we know John is the subject of the sentence. It's a noun, doesn't look much like a verb. You can't say Johning, Johned, right? You can't do anything to this guy that you would do to a verb. On the other hand, look at this, had. What do we see here at the very end? We see this past tense D. So even though the verb have is irregular in English, you don't say John haved been. So you still see the past tense marker though, that tells you this is something that happened before the speaker of the sentence said this sentence. And then if you look at your next form, you have this been, this en form, which we were calling the past participle. And remember that the past participle is not necessarily always going to appear with the past tense. It may appear with the past tense, but It also may appear with all of the other tenses. So, it's a very, very, very misleading word that I use only because that's the way that they talk about it in the books. I want you to be familiar. Past participle, just think about it as participle. Just think about it as this is a form of the verb that has to occur in certain environments in English. Just think about it that way. Don't think about past tense. Okay, and then the next verb you have here is dreaming, and what do we have that tells us that this is a verb? We have the ing, so we have a piece of evidence for thinking that dreaming itself is in the progressive, right? That's the progressive affix, the ing. So all of these three guys together are making up our verb group. And what's interesting in English is that you can have a sequence of several verbs like this, and they have to occur in a certain order. So that's sort of the basis of everything that we're going to say about verb groups. For example, if you said, John had dreaming been about the play. Imagine somebody comes up to you and they just say that, right? You just sort of look at them like, what's going on? You know, why did they say it that way? Or imagine if somebody said, John dreaming Ben had about the play. It wouldn't sound like a sentence of English. It might be a sentence of English that somebody would say if they were learning English, and then you would sort of pause and you'd think about it, and you'd be like, okay, what did they mean by saying that? What, you know, you try to put it together into the structure of English that you have in your mind. And so it's not that it doesn't make sense to have the verbs occurring in that order. It does make sense because it's conveying the same information. It's just that the rules of English tell us that within the verb group, we have a pattern about where it is that the different verbs occur. So when you have had been dreaming, it has to be had been dreaming. It can't be had dreaming been. Dreaming had been. Been dreaming had, right? Any other order is impossible. So this is what we want to try to figure out. We want to try to figure out what are the generalizations about where it is that we find the different items within the verb group. So looking at the verb group structure, notice that you could have as well a very simple verb group structure. So you could have the sentence Mary slept. What is within this verb group is just the verb slept. You will always have at least one verb in every sentence. And if you have only one, you know that that's the main verb. That's the end of what you have to say about the verb group, because there's nothing else there. You just have the main verb, and that's it. So you're finished with your analysis. If you have just a single main verb in a sentence, regardless of what that main verb is, you are complete in terms of analyzing that verb group. So let's look at some examples where we have verb groups of different sorts, and we're going to talk about what are the different possible structures that you can have with a verb group. So notice that the auxiliary verbs of English appear in different types. So the first type of auxiliary verb that we're going to talk about are the modal verbs. And these are the verbs that are discussed in chapter 6. These are the verbs such as should, would, could, might. And then if you think about what's going on with all of these verbs I've put here so far, they all end in this D, right? Should, would, could, and then here you have T for might, which looks similar to our past tense markers. So in fact, these are the past tense forms of the modal auxiliary verbs. And then thinking about it that way, we can think that, therefore, the present tense counterparts to those verbs are going to be the following verbs. So shall, of course, in American English, it's not very common to use this. So if you're just casually speaking English, it's a little bit odd if you say, I shall come to your house tomorrow, right? Sounds out of place. But you do use it in more formal language, and we find it in other forms of English other than American English. So, and you can see it in particular contexts, you know, shall we meet at 6, something like that. So in a question context, you sometimes have that still showing up. But the important generalization is that even if it's not a very productive thing for you to say in your speech, you still know exactly where you would put it in the sentence if you were to have a sentence that included that word. So you have knowledge of the syntax of that word. Okay, and then we have would, and the counterpart for would is going to be will. In other words, will is the present tense form of the past tense would. So would and will are both modal verbs. All of these guys that we're talking about now are all modal verbs, and they all have the property of necessarily appearing first in the verb group. If you have a modal verb, that verb has to be first. Of course, if you don't have a modal verb, then whatever you have is going to appear in that position, right? You don't have to have a modal verb in every verb group. So could, the counterpart is going to be can, and might, the counterpart is going to be may. Now notice, please notice this because it's so important. This is so important. When we say that should and would and could and might are in the past tense, we're talking about the form of that word. In other words, it ends with this marker that looks like a past tense marker. But we are not talking about the meaning of that form. Because, for example, if I said to you, you should clean your room. You should clean your room. And so there you have the should, which in its form, we're saying is past tense. But when we understand that sentence, you should clean your room, it's not as if the cleaning takes place in the past, right? If anything, it's intended to take place in the future from the point of view of the time at which you say the sentence. So when we say past tense form, we do not mean past tense meaning. We do not mean an event that takes place before the time at which you say the sentence. So for example, if you look at would, you could say something like, she would like to go to the movies with you. She would like to go to the movies with you. When is the liking happening? She would like to go to the movies with you. Well, most naturally, it's understood as being a situation that obtains now, at the present time. However, we use this thing that we're calling a past tense. So why is this guy a past tense? Purely because of its form. Purely because of its form. Do not try to think about modals with respect to the meaning of their tenses, because you will go insane, and I will have to come and get you from Jackson Memorial, and I don't want to do that, okay? So promise to not do that. Do not think about modals with respect to their tense meanings. Just think about them with respect to the forms that they show. If you have a D and if you have a T at the end of that form, it's past tense, that's it. Don't think about it, okay? So the idea is that with all of these guys, all of these modal verbs, they appear in the first position in the sentence. So for example, if you have something like Mary might clean the room. Right? So Mary might clean the room is going to be constituted, first we know primarily of two things, because the sentence, the subject and the predicate of the sentence. Our subject is going to be Mary. We can mark this. And our predicate is therefore everything else in the sentence, might clean the room. So we're thinking about what is going on with the internal structure of this predicate with respect not to what are the complements of the verb. So you have a non-transitive, you have ditransitive, you have complex transitive, but what's happening within the verb group itself, just within that unit that contains the main verb and all the other verbs. So what do we have there? We have might. How do we know that this is a verb? It's showing up in the past tense. It's one of those modal verbs. And then the following verb, clean. Notice that clean is in the base form. So modal verbs, in other words, require the modal to be followed by the next verb in its base form. In other words, base form is just with no markers on it whatsoever. There's nothing at the end of the verb. It's just the verb itself. There's no past participle marker. There's no present participle marker. There's no past tense marker. There's nothing that is appearing at the end. So, for example, when you have might clean, you see that clean cannot appear as Mary might cleaning the room. If you added ing, that would be weird. Or if you added ed, Mary might clean the room. That's weird, right? So the idea is that modal verbs all work the same way. They all require that their following verb, whatever that verb is, be in the simple form. In other words, no markers at the end. So the modal takes a verb which is unmarked. And if we were looking at this verb group, so we would say that might and clean constitute the verb group. And then we want to think about how we're going to break that down. Well, we have two basic parts to any verb group that includes an auxiliary, right? We're going to have the auxiliary part and we're going to have the main verb part. So we could say that this verb group is comprised of the main verb clean, which you know is always going to be the last verb in the verb group. In English, the last verb in the verb group is always the main verb. And then everything that comes before is going to follow necessarily being an auxiliary verb, some type of auxiliary verb. And then we want to think about, well, what type of auxiliary verb do you have? So over here, you're going to have the title aux to tell you anything that comes within here, it's some type of auxiliary verb. So since might is a modal verb, we're going to label that modal. You can put MOD. And the other piece of information that you want to put here is the tense of this form. So what is the tense? Well, we know that this T is really standing for not the meaning, but the form of the past tense. So even though it may not carry the meaning of past tense, it's in the past tense form. And therefore, we could put a little label here just above the verb might that tells us that this is a past tense form. So if you ask yourself, what type of sentence do I have here in terms of the verb group, you would say I have a past modal sentence. The sentence is in the past modal. Why past? Because you have T at the end of might. And why modal? Because might falls into the class of modal verbs. So you could think about when you're going through these verb groups, the different types of verb groups that you have, always think about other instances of that same type. For example, what would be another past modal verb group? Any of those modal verbs that ended in T or D is going to be a past modal, right? So, for example, if you had should sleep, this is going to have exactly the same structure as this verb group, because it's comprised of an auxiliary verb, which is a modal, and it's in the past tense, followed by the main verb, sleep. So if you were going to give the structure for the modal verb should plus the main verb sleep, it's going to look like this. Should, sleep. Okay, so the whole verb group, everything that is the main verb plus all the helping verbs. And you know that the verb group is comprised of necessarily the main verb on the very end, necessarily in English, the very end. Everything occurring before it must be an auxiliary of some type, and we know that the type that we have here is the modal type. And what tense do we see this in? We see it in past tense. Why? Because it ends in D. Don't think about it. It's the past tense form. Okay, so think about it as past tense is just meaning that it shows up with this marker at the end. That's the only meaning that that has, okay? So that's an example, should sleep.